Good afternoon, Joe. Let's begin by your telling our listeners a bit about your background in economic and community development.
Well, thanks, Doug. My background, actually, I guess my story, although I'm a longtime Clevelander, began in Cleveland in 1980. I graduated from Cleveland State University with a degree in political science and had an opportunity to secure a position with the community development program for Cuyahoga County, which is the county in which Cleveland is located. And I spent about 3 years working in that field, essentially working in the urban county, which was a form of CDBG financing and other types of local grant-making support that was provided outside of the city of Cleveland. We essentially, Cleveland was an entitlement city for HUD purposes, so therefore they received their funding directly, and we were able to work in mainly suburban locations. In 1983, I had an opportunity to secure a position with newly elected Governor Dick Celeste at the state Ohio Department of Development, and had an opportunity to go down to Columbus. So my wife and I relocated, and I ran a number of programs at the time that reflected the balance of state HUD program, and had an opportunity to work really, again, outside of entitlement communities, but to work in all 88 counties and many municipalities throughout the state of Ohio. We distributed about $45 million annually, and in essence took the place of HUD in terms of the distribution system for those dollars. So that was a great experience. And then a number of years into that, I had an opportunity to move over to the business development field, and ended up spending time running the business attraction programs for the state of Ohio, as well as the reverse investment in trade functions for the state of Ohio in my last 4 years working for Dick Celeste. So it was a great opportunity to kind of learn the business, and it was, by the way, my first exposure to an old colleague and an old friend of mine, Jeff Finkel, and we partnered up and provided some training through NDC for the people within the state of Ohio, people that we were working with across the state. So it was a great opportunity. I then had the
I might butt in just a second, Joe, and tell our listeners, or remind our listeners, that Jeff Finkel is the president and CEO of the International Economic Development Council. And, of course, he's done a couple of podcasts for this block. Now, back to you, Joe.
No, Doug, I assume that your listeners are familiar with Jeff and some of the great work that he has done. But I then had an opportunity to come back to Cleveland. Mike White, who was a state senator at the time, was elected mayor of the city of Cleveland, and he asked me to come back to Cleveland and become his economic development director, which I accepted, and I came back in the first part of 1990. And really spent 4 years working for Mike White in his first term, and had the opportunity to work on really some extremely large and catalytic projects within the city of Cleveland. For example, the Gateway Sports Complex. We were able to put the financing together and see that become a reality in downtown Cleveland. We had the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. We had numerous UDAGs that we worked on across the city, and it really was a great opportunity for me to kind of hone my economic development background and experiences. And then I had further a great opportunity to join the Playhouse Square Foundation and do the real estate development work for one of the largest performing arts centers in the country. And in that role, I oversaw their fiscal assets as well as the expansion of the real estate portfolio. They very creatively took an idea of using real estate to create working endowments and really animate the district there. And so I spent about close to 8 years working within that framework, and then shifted my focus to a greater downtown role, and joined our predecessor organization called Downtown Cleveland Partnership. And in that role, did, again, real estate-related work as Executive Vice President for that organization. And then in 2005, I had the opportunity to become CEO, and then subsequently we reconstituted, from a governance perspective, the organization and created the Downtown Cleveland Alliance. So I began my career, I guess, in more traditional economic development circles, and have spent the last component of my career working more concretely in a downtown setting. And of course, a downtown setting means everything from placemaking to real estate development to business attraction and retention.
Well, you've had quite a career up to now, and let's home in on the organization you currently head as CEO, the Cleveland Downtown Alliance. Tell us why the Alliance was created and what is it, basically?
Well, let me begin, Doug, with maybe the second question first. The Alliance is a nonprofit entity that was created in 2006, and our mission is really twofold. It's to improve the pedestrian environment in downtown Cleveland, and by improving that environment, work to attract additional investment into downtown. And I could talk a little bit about the successes, but let me take you back to the early part of the decade of the 2000s. When our predecessor organization was in place, as I mentioned, Downtown Cleveland Partnership. And the partnership was, I would say, a chamber-like model. We had about 55 board members. It was membership-based. It was an organization that tended to be top-down, a lot of corporate representation. And we did receive strong philanthropic support at the time. And principally from the Cleveland Foundation, the Gunn Foundation, and the Kent H. Charitable Trust, which were the foundations that were providing us in excess of $1 million annually. And a couple of things started to occur. One was the foundations became more and more uncomfortable with the fact that there were other organizations in the geography of downtown that were also seeking funds from them, mainly neighborhood-based organizations. And the foundations became more and more uncomfortable with that fragmented environment. They had reorganized Cleveland neighborhoods and created an organization called Cleveland Neighborhood Progress to consolidate and streamline their funding. And they very much wanted to see something similar in downtown Cleveland. The second thing was we had struggled for a set of reasons to create an assessment district in downtown. And whether you're familiar with some of the larger ones across the country like Center City, Philadelphia, or Times Square, or Grand Central Partnership in New York, Ohio was fairly late to the game in state and neighborhood legislation to create it. And we had struggled in downtown to convince property owners to take that step. And
would you explain the concept? I am positive, Joe, that many, if not the majority of our listeners, are not familiar with the idea of an assessment district. Explain a little bit the mechanics, if you would.
Assessment districts, Doug, are simply a group of property owners, and depending on different states, because different states have different enabling laws, but in Ohio, a group of property owners can come together and through an affirmative petition process ask the municipality to assess them for an enhanced portfolio of services. Now, as you know, an assessment is a fancy way of saying taxes. So the discussion of talking to property owners in downtown Cleveland and saying, hey, why don't you tax yourself for an additional set of services was somewhat of a struggle. And when you overlaid that kind of philosophical struggle, we also had neighborhood-based organizations, in particular the Warehouse District here and the Gateway neighborhoods. Both were very established, but grassroots organizations led by some very able people. In fact, I'm going to talk a little bit more about Tom Yablonsky, who was the executive director of those organizations. But there was a fundamental distrust that if we created this assessment district, it would usurp the position of these neighborhood-based organizations. So we had this undercurrent of conflict where neighborhood-based organizations really didn't trust what we were trying to do. We had the external pressures from the Cleveland Foundation, the Gunn Foundation in particular, that were pushing us to consolidate and create a single voice for downtown. And for a number of years, we really did struggle with how do we do this. So when I became president of the predecessor organization, we began to tackle this really in a multiple way. One was I had to figure out a way to get our property owners to feel comfortable with the concept of an assessment. So to be honest, I reached out to a corporate CEO of a local bank here, David Goldberg, the CEO of Ohio Savings, who was a naysayer, and said, I really don't think we should do this. The city of Cleveland should provide these types of services, and we, I'm not for it. So we essentially said, if we can't convince David that this makes sense, we probably are never going to get it done. So we literally asked David to chair the committee, and he agreed to do it with no strings attached. He said, I'll be happy to do it, Joe, but if at the end of the day, if I don't think it's a good thing for downtown, if I don't think it's a good thing for Ohio Savings, I will oppose it. I said fine, and I had another strong ally with another property owner named Tom Adler, who was very supportive, kind of a counterbalance to David. I elicited the strong support of our city councilman, who at the time was a young, very aggressive councilman named Joe Sipperman. Joe became an advocate working with us, and we also then brought the foundations to the table, and in particular, the Cleveland Foundation, led by Jay Talbot, who really rolled his sleeves up, along with Bob Jaquay from the Gun Foundation, and again, with the philosophy that we needed the foundations at the table to see what we were doing and how we were doing it. And it was another leverage point, because in our discussions with the property owners, we said, look, if we can convince you to assess yourself, we think we can get a long-term commitment out of the foundations on an annual basis to help create the corpus, if you will, or the budget that we need in order to push downtown Cleveland forward. So we spent about 6 months earnestly having focus group meetings, reaching out to small property owners, large property owners. Joe Sipperman in particular was my ally in kind of organizing the CATs, and again, inviting a property owner to a meeting to talk about, taxing themselves for services that in their worldview was something the city should be providing. In other words, cleaning services, safety services, things of that nature. It became very, very difficult. And conversely, we asked the foundations, and I'd add the Kent Bay Charitable Trust and Phil Rainey, who was the CEO of that organization, to the table to say, okay, how do we now begin to look at a governance structure that allows us to move forward? And on a parallel basis, I also started working hand in hand with Tom Yablowski, who was the executive director of those grassroots organizations. And Tom and I had known each other for many years, especially going back to my days at the city of Cleveland. Tom and I had a good working relationship, and we decided to kind of, again, do the blocking and tackling in terms of us talking, trying to figure out, okay, how can we make this work in a way that the property owners and the people involved in the grassroots organizations would be comfortable with. And we essentially reached some structural agreements that we thought could make some sense. And let me give you an example. Tom and I worked out a scenario where Tom would become the executive vice president for the alliance, meaning the umbrella group, but still retain his executive director role at the neighborhood-based groups. And
remind us the names of those groups again, will you?
In Cleveland, both groups actually were supported by a single staff. It was the Historic Gateway District and the Historic Warehouse District, which both were kind of, again, neighborhoods within the city that had organized, within downtown that had organized themselves. So once Tom and I felt that we could work together, that then became kind of the foundation for us to really kind of put some of the animosity and the fear behind us. And it also helped, I think, with the property owners, because once the property owners saw that Tom and I were on the same page, and we slowly began to convince people like David Goldberg and some of the other private property owners that this could make some sense and we could leverage the dollars, we slowly began to turn the ship and get people to say, yeah, this makes a lot of sense. And
I'm assuming here, Joe, that you are a classic extrovert who loves to work with people. But you must have spent hours and hours and hours in meetings. And
well, we spent a lot of time in meetings. We had a steering committee of about 35 people. Again, some of those foundation representatives I talked to, that I mentioned earlier, Jay Talbot, Bob Jaquay, Phil Rainey. We had a couple dozen property owners. We had Joe Sipperman. We reached out to the mayor of the city at the time, Jane Campbell. We reached out to Frank Jackson, who was the council president, and some of the other members of council, because at the end of the day, you still had to get the assessment approved through the legislative body. And by the way, we knew if we didn't have a strong majority going in, there was, under Ohio law, property owners who objected still had the ability to go to city council and fight it. So we knew we had to deal with multiple political levels here and make sure that we had the base in place. So we at the end of the day, when we turned the tide and got David in particular as the chairman of the committee to say, hey, I'm ready to support this, we literally treated it like a political campaign. We had a big, we used the Palace Theater, which is a 2,000-seat theater in the Playoff Square complex, and we brought property owners in. We put, David and a number of the committee members up on stage. In fact, in the middle of all this, to be honest, to add some complexity to it, we had the mayor of the city of Cleveland, Jane Campbell, and by this time, in 2005, Frank Jackson, who was the council president, was an announced candidate to try to replace her. And we had both of them up on stage, both supporting the creation of this assessment district. So you can imagine.
Frank is the mayor now, isn't he, of Cleveland?
Frank's the current mayor. He beat Jane Campbell after her first term, and essentially, if you think about it, or if you think of the theatrics, I had to put the mayor on one side of the stage and Frank Jackson, the council president, on the other side of the stage to make sure it worked. And the reality is we were able to get that supermajority because, again, under Ohio law, we had to get at least 60% of the property owners to say yes. And we were able to put the assessment district in place, which was, again, long-term, a key component of creating an organization that had long-term stability.
So now, why don't we turn to the governance aspect of this? Tell us a bit about how the Cleveland Downtown Alliance is governed and how you brought all these pieces together. Tell us about the architecture.
Well, the architecture really is, and that's a great question, Doug, is again somewhat complicated because of Ohio law. The assessment district that I mentioned, the way the statute in Ohio worked is everybody, once the district was created, and if you think about downtown Cleveland, it was about a 20-block district. And every property owner in the district, once it was established, was members of a new corporate entity. We had to literally create a corporation to house it. And the corporation then elected its own board and its own leadership. But the limitation of that model was the fact that you couldn't have non-property owners participate in the governance structure. And we knew right up front that that was going to be a shortcoming. So what we did is we created the alliance, which, as the name implies, is a confederation of interests, including the property owners. And we, in essence, created a 501c3 through the alliance, and we assigned board seats. Initially, a lot of the property ownership were appointed by the corporation called the Cleveland Improvement District, which was the corporate entity that we had to create under state law. And then we created neighborhood-based positions that ensured that all of the neighborhoods in downtown, and in particular those two neighborhoods that I talked about a few minutes ago, the Gateway District and the Warehouse District, were assured of permanent representation in the new structure. So if you think about it, the alliance then became the operating entity by contract. In fact, we executed a 35-page contract with the property ownership group. They technically could fire the alliance if they didn't think the alliance was doing its job. But the way the legislation works is the assessment dollars flow through that property ownership corporation and then flow by contract over to the alliance. So all of the staff, all of the service delivery is in the hands of the alliance. And by doing that mechanism, we were able to then, going back to the foundations, we were able to go to the foundations and say, we now have the assessment in place through this model, through this governance structure, will you continue to work with us and fund us? And by the way, we became the entity that applied to all the foundations for operating support, not only for ourselves, but for our neighborhood-based partners. So we, in essence, became a pass-through organization to assist them.
So in a very real sense, the improvement district and the neighborhood organizations are not only stakeholders, they have an ownership.
They have an ownership property. You're absolutely right. They've got equity in the process. And again, it was very delicately negotiated in terms of making sure that about half of the board about a third of the board were property owners, a third of the board were neighborhood-based individuals, and then we left open the opportunity to have large employers in downtown and other, traditional interests that you'd want at the table in this scenario. For example, a key bank, which is a major institution here in Cleveland, as you know, a large bank headquartered in Cleveland, doesn't own any real estate. So for us, we needed to make sure that we could have companies like that also have a seat at the table. Although we, by design, kept the board fairly small. Initially, it was a 24-person board with an 11-person executive committee that worked through the process. The other thing we did, again, very strategically, Doug, was we recognized that we needed to have good board representation in both the property ownership board as well as the alliance board, and we decided that we would populate all of the committees with both boards so that all of our operating committees, marketing, finance, are all co-populated by both boards. And all of the board members are invited to each other's board meetings, so that if I'm a property owner and I may sit on the property ownership board, I know of all the alliance meetings. I can go to those, and I'm expected to participate in the committee process where as you know, like all nonprofits, committees where a lion's share of the work gets done, and then obviously gets brought forward to the larger board.
So before we talk a bit about how the alliance is working and what the future looks like, what would you say, Joe, is the greatest problem you had to solve to bring all this together? What was the biggest challenge, the largest nut you had to crack to make this happen?
Well, I think the largest challenge, ultimately getting property owners to say yes was important, but we couldn't get property owners to say yes without eliminating the underlying fear of creating an organization like this. Again, Cleveland has a long history, both within downtown and in our neighborhoods, of strong neighborhood-based organizations. And in many ways, they're the strength of the community. They do a lot of good work. The Historic Warehouse District and the Historic Gateway neighborhood here in downtown did great work over the years. So the kind of the push to streamline and create more of a what I would call more of a unified corporate model. As you know, the trend has always been in the private sector is to consolidate and create economies of scale. But kind of overcoming this fear that we're going to get lost in the process, our voices are going to get diminished, that really in many ways was the biggest challenge, because they had done such a great job of keeping those grassroots voices in the process, and the equity that they brought to their organizations, I think, was important. So that in some ways was critical. And in fact, we worked with a consultant named Brad Siegel out of Denver, who does a lot of work with downtowns, and he struggled with the model that we created because he wasn't entirely sure that it would work. The neat thing is now we've continued to work with Brad over the years in terms of reality checks and some strategic planning work. He now uses this as a case study as how to create a complex but very nuanced governance model that has worked very well for us.
So, you're at the helm of the alliance, and when did you take the helm again?
We created the alliance in early 2006. So I was appointed the CEO at that point.
Okay, 2006. So you got around 12 years.
Yes.
So is the alliance working as you intended? Have you had to do some tweaking, and if so, what? Just tell us how it's going.
Well, the neat thing, Doug, is that we've evolved, and we've evolved, I think, in a very constructive, very positive way. And let me kind of talk a little bit about that 12-year continuum. Early on, one of the keys for us in using the assessment dollars that I mentioned was the ambassadors that we put out into the street. The ambassadors really have two goals, again, going back to that philosophical approach of improving the pedestrian experience in downtown. One was to act as walking concierges, to walk the streets as the eyes and ears for the Cleveland police. All of these ambassadors are full-time, so they're specially trained. And the perception that we created and kind of had to overcome was that downtown wasn't safe and it wasn't very clean. So we also have cleaning ambassadors that work in downtown. And for the first 5 years of our existence, although we did some other things, we knew that we had to create a very strong clean and safe program that through our ambassadors, through the men and women that we put onto the streets of Cleveland, that people will feel more comfortable with downtown. So
now, these ambassadors, are they volunteers or are they staff?
No. They're paid. They're paid. They're paid a living wage. They actually have full benefits. They're fully trained. They're not enforcement officers, but they are trained to identify difficult situations and, as I said, to bring off-duty Cleveland policemen to the table or on-duty Cleveland police to help with difficult situations. Once we were able to do that, we decided that we wanted to expand our portfolio to include business development, and we brought on board Michael Deemer, my Executive Vice President for Business Development. We created a 4-person team that on a day-to-day basis is looking to attract more investment into downtown. To be honest, most downtown organizations across the country do not do, or we're not doing this at the time that we made that decision. But it's really helped us because we now work with the commercial brokerage community to attract new tenants into downtown. We work with building owners to help them put financial packages together to help them invest in downtown. We work as a one-stop to help with permitting through the city of Cleveland. We're experts at historic preservation, so we know how to guide some of those projects. And the neat thing is, although we're not equity investors and nor do we own property, we're catalytic by design, we've been able to, again, really work to attract more jobs into downtown. And as part of that, we've expanded the portfolio beyond just business development to attracting housing into downtown. And the neat thing is, in our most recent iterations, we now have about just under 16,000 residents in downtown. We're working with about 17 projects that we think will push us to about 20,000 residents in downtown Cleveland by the end of 2020. And what that does is residents animate the space in a way that office workers don't. Cleveland traditionally was a 9-to-5 type of town. At the end of the day, people went home to their suburban locations or to their Cleveland neighborhood homes. Now we have people every day in downtown Cleveland. So the perception of downtown is radically different now than it was 12 years ago. Now When we talked to a company about moving into downtown years ago, the first question was, well, it's not clean and it's not safe. We never hear those questions now. What we hear now is, where are we going to park? which is our new challenge.
That's a good problem.
It's a good problem. It's a good problem.
Did you, by the way, get involved? Did the Alliance get involved in Heinen's, the supermarket chain, opening at the downtown store?
Yeah. In fact, working with our neighborhood-based partners, the Historic Gateway District, we in fact stepped into the shoes with one of our developers to save the complex and to save historic tax credits that were awarded to the complex that were about to be lost. That allowed then the project to refocus itself. It allowed another developer, Fred and Greg Geis, the Geis family, to step in. And through the tax credits at both federal level and the state level, they, I think, secured $39 million of equity for the entire complex, which was about a $200 million investment. But the centerpiece of that was taking the old Ameritrust Rotunda at the apex of downtown Cleveland at 9th and Euclid, which had been vacant for years and years, and transforming it into a new regional grocery store, which is Heinen's that you mentioned a moment ago, Doug. So
it may be the most amazing supermarket I've ever come across in my lifetime.
Well, again, this was the old Cleveland Trust Rotunda. If you know Cleveland's history, that later became Ameritrust.
Tiffany glass.
Tiffany, beautiful Tiffany ceilings and beautiful historic murals of the city. And you're right, you can obviously do traditional grocery shopping there, or you can sit and enjoy some sandwiches and fresh, fresh soups and other types of things, and wine and beer. And that's really helped us because, as you know, one of the keys in bringing residents into downtown are the amenity bases that you can create. And obviously a grocery store of that caliber was important to our strategy. So again, now we're proactively working on those types of projects in our work in downtown, which we think has added great benefit.
So what's on the horizon? You've got your governance structure functioning well. You've posted some really significant achievements. What's coming up?
Well, Doug, what's interesting is as we've become more visible, and especially we now are regarded as clean and safe experts in Northeast Ohio. In fact, we have been invited to provide those services outside of downtown on a contract basis. We now have close to a dozen contracts where we, in essence, provide those same type of clean and safe ambassadors to various neighborhoods within the city of Cleveland. In fact, recently we navigated a contract with the Cuyahoga County and Cleveland Port Authority to what we think is the first maritime ambassador program in the country. They invested in two ships, or vessels, excuse me, they're not ships, to help remove debris on the Cuyahoga River and Cleveland's lakefront. And we agreed to train our ambassadors in maritime work to allow them to be certified to operate these vessels. So we've got ambassadors that literally are on two vessels, 9 months of the year, keeping the Cuyahoga River clean as well as the lakefront clean. So the fact we've kind of developed this expertise and the brand is to be honest, become a very strong brand. We're now again in the marketplace using that service expertise through various contracts throughout the city.
Well, Joe Marinucci, you have told a great story in several respects. I really appreciate you taking the time this afternoon to tell us about the creation of the Downtown Cleveland Alliance, and I think we have a part 2 coming up here eventually when you can bring us up to date. few
Well,
minutes.
I'd love that opportunity, and Doug, it's nice to join you today, and obviously enjoy sharing our story here. And it's one of those 12-year odysseys that you look up and you recount a lot of history. But it's fun to go back and remember some of the people that really were instrumental in helping us achieve this. So I appreciate you allowing me that opportunity to tell the story.
Well, and we appreciate you taking the time to tell the story, and I understand that you and your wife are headed off to a resort in Cancun tomorrow. So
that's correct. I'm looking forward to a week on the beaches of Cancun. So
bon voyage.